a bad thing happens, like a drought or an ice age or a flood, you are much less likely to survive by being totally independent than is somebody who interacts well with others and is part of a society where you can rely on other people to help you, and you can help other people yourself, knowing that they will help you in the future. So we could assume that there is some process of natural selection involved that guarantees that people who work and play well with others will reproduce and continue, and the people who don't will tend to be eliminated over time. Whether that's completely true, we can sort of see it as a possible theory. And social neuroscience, we are biopsychosocial organisms. So this is true. We're biological beings, we're psychological beings, and we're social beings. All of these things create who we are. Continuing with the big ideas, social psychology's principles are applicable in everyday life. And this is how we get to know ourselves better. And there are implications for human health, the choices we make, and the effect of those choices on ourselves and others, such as overeating or not eating healthy, such as smoking, such as the effect of smoke on others. Secondhand smoke, we call that now. The implications for judicial procedures. How do we judge someone as a criminal if, for example, in the United States, this is implicitly applying to the United States, how do we judge someone as a criminal when there are mandatory sentences? I was reading a story yesterday about a law in Florida where if you commit a felony and you have a gun, whether you use it or not, you have to go to jail for 10 years. If you fire the gun, whether someone gets hurt or not, you have to go to jail for 20 years. And if someone does get hurt, it's 25 to life. Whatever the crime was, and whatever your criminal record was prior to that crime. So in the case that I was reading about, it was a woman who was defending herself from an implied threat by her ex-husband, and she fired a warning shot to get her ex-husband to leave her alone so she could get the rest of her stuff and finish moving out. And she ended up being sent to jail for 20 years as a result of that, a woman with no criminal record. And the principles of social psychology influence behavior, as we've seen throughout the presentation today. Social psychology and human values, obvious ways values enter psychology. So values, things that we think of as good or bad, enter psychology. Things we pass judgment on as a value. And this is through the research topics of psychology. We eventually place a value on things. Through the types of people who are studied in psychology and who themselves practice psychology, values come into psychology. And through the object of socio-psychological analysis in psychology, such as how values form, why they change, and how they influence attitudes and actions. Obvious example, there was a time in recent history, and I realize when I say recent history, most of you are thinking in the last 20 years. History is the last thousands and thousands of years, about 5,000 years we usually refer to as history. So it was only a couple hundred years ago that slavery was considered more or less normal. If you go back to 1812, we're in 2012 right now, if we go back to 1812, slavery was very common all over the world. And so that value judged slavery as being okay, at least in some situations. Why did those values change? And how were the changes influenced? How did they influence attitudes and actions? People on slavery subsequently, this being an obvious example of a major value that has changed, because a lot of people who owned slaves were very religious. And I might add, slavery was also common in the Islamic world, not just in the Western Hemisphere. So, not so obvious ways that values come into psychology. This is important as well. The subjective aspects of science, which is the culture and social representation of the scientist, of the researcher, of where the researcher is located. If we think of the fact that even though we're in Albania, unless you're doing this somewhere outside of Albania, I know there's talk of them having a course up in Macedonia through this university. But the fact that you're doing this in English should tell you something. There's obviously a bias in everything that you are learning here in all of these classes towards the West and towards the United States especially, since most of your books are from the United States. Most of your presentations are coordinated with books that are printed in the United States that come from the American Academy. So this is significant in that there's a natural bias. In terms of social representation, we can also think of the values of our respective religions. Even though I'm not particularly religious, I still tend to value the idea of goodness. The definition of what constitutes a good person generally comes from the predominant religion in my culture, which is obviously Christianity. For some of you, Albania is kind of a tricky country that way. But some of us are Muslims here and some of us are Christians, and then it depends on what kind of Christian you are. And then in all religions, it depends whether you're serious about your religion or not. You still have the same idea of what constitutes a good person. And this is generally common to all Abrahamic religions, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of those things come into psychology as well because the social scientist, him or herself, has that predisposition towards those Abrahamic definitions of goodness and badness. And the psychological concepts contain hidden values. What do we mean by a good life? What makes life complete? I told you about my sister earlier in this exercise. Has she not led a good life because she hasn't had children? She had an opportunity to adopt along the way. They looked at that. They even looked at international adoption. A couple of their friends adopted, I think, a girl from China. Maybe it was two girls, I don't remember. But they looked at that and decided not to. Does that mean my sister is selfish, deciding not to do that? Or does that mean she hasn't lived a complete life according to Maslow, to return to that hierarchy of needs? So psychological concepts contain hidden values that we're not aware of necessarily, but assumptions that are there. Psychological concepts contain professional advice. Okay, Maslow, for example, hierarchy of needs, that's advice on what it takes to self-actualize. If you haven't followed his steps up the pyramid, then you're not really a grown-up. That's an interesting concept to get your mind around, but it certainly applies here. Forming concepts, psychological concepts contain hidden values in how you form ideas and how you label things. Again, good and bad. That person is a good person, and you have an idea why. If I ask you to define it, you'll often find it comes down to one or two insignificant acts that made you identify that person as a good person. So, isn't social psychology just common sense? The problem with common sense, and we'll get into this, yes, on this screen, is common sense is not necessarily so obvious, and common sense is often wrong. Sometimes the quickest way out is not, if you're in the mountains, is not going downhill. You'd think if you go downhill, I'm lost and I'm in the mountains. If I go downhill, I should find my way out of here. Not necessarily. Where were we at here? I'm sorry, I lost my place in my script here. One problem with trying to explain social behavior is that everyone has an explanation. This explanation always comes into play after we know the facts. So, for example, the other night, I was watching the UEFA Championship game, and most people, I'm making a generalization here, this is not fair. You will meet many people who will tell you after the game, I knew that Chelsea was going to win, and here's why. All right, this is very normal. This is a psychological phenomenon. None of those people would have said that with a great degree of confidence before the game, but they all can say it afterwards. And this is the tendency to exaggerate after learning an outcome, one's ability to have foreseen it. Right? They can say, well, I know Chelsea was missing some players, but so was Munich. They were missing some players as well. So that was even, and I knew that Chelsea would win. It's painful to me. I don't like Chelsea very much. And hindsight bias, I knew it all along. This most common example today, people say that if we had a different president during 9/11, Albert Gore comes to mind. I think his name is Albert, I might be wrong, but Al Gore ran against George W. Bush. And if we'd had a different president, or if the people in charge had been more competent, we somehow would have believed that people would hijack planes and fly them into buildings. Okay, this is not something that is obvious at all, the way those agencies are set up. I don't think it matters who was president at the time of the 9/11 attacks. No one would have really been able to stop them. And if they were stopped, it was probably just complete luck, or would have been stopped. We're getting into very conditional here. And the world financial crisis in 2008, same idea. If you were like me, and I'm not a big time investor, I had a chance to take a job once in that particular sector of the financial industry, and I figured, no way, there's no way this balloon can keep going on very long. And that was in, I think, 2002. So really, if I had joined the financial industry then, I would have had 5 good years of making really good money. Instead, I decided to become a college professor. So I have a job now, as opposed to many of the people I would have been working with. Perhaps I'm wise. Not sure why this screen is here, except for obvious reasons of what we're doing in this chapter. It's not well fitted to this presentation.